Scour the interwebs and you'll find countless listicles on worst consoles and worst selling consoles. Admittedly, it's a rather vanilla and clickbaity subject. I mean, that's why I'm doing one. But out of all of these articles, surprisingly, no one has ever created a list based on their actual sales numbers. For example, 90s stalwarts GamePro here thought that the Apple Pippin was the worst selling console ever, where in actual fact, it's a little bit more successful than that on my list. So this episode, myself and my friends at AllTimeGaming, because crossover, fill in this hole that no one asked to be filled as we look at systems that were less popular than a Peter Molyneux Kickstarter. As I say, but hello you. I'm Guru Larry.
And I'm Chris.
I'm Jamie.
And I'm Alex.
And we welcome you to Fact Hunt. Top 10 actual worst selling consoles. But before we meet the true contenders for this video, let's have a look at the consoles that just missed the mark. At number 10, gamers palmed off this palm-top-based gaming handheld with the Tapwave Zodiac with 190,000 sales. At number 9, a system that did so badly they tried to turn to hentai to get sales. And a fat lot of chance that did for them with NEC's PCFX and a less than impressive 100,000 sales. Number 8 is back with another NEC console, the overpriced, underperforming TurboGrafx successor, the SuperGrafx, at 75,000 sales. Number 7 rolls in the lazy listicles incorrect number 1 worst selling console, the Bandai Apple Pippin, with just 48,000 sales. And those of you who saw the Rotting Consoles episode of Fact Hunt will rejoice that at number 6, it's Alan Sugar's exploding box of crap, the Amstrad GX4000, with a paltry 40,000 sales. So, if only 40,000 sales only gets you a 6th position, how bad did our worst 5 actually get? You know a console's completely screwed right out of the gate when you have a company that's so neurotic they want to spend millions to compete with the Philips CDI of all things. And that's exactly what Commodore did in the early 90s with the CDTV. Now, it may sound completely bonkers by today's standards, and that's because it is, but this was a time when the press were heralding the CDI as a future of consumer technology. The emerging high-end market didn't want silly little plumbers and hedgehogs invading their yuppie apartments. Oh no! They wanted the ability to access an entire shelf of encyclopedias from a single CD, and play virtual adaptations of Trivial Pursuit on their giant 22-inch CRT televisions. So with this exciting new market and consumer technology emerging, and Philips as the sole competition, it was too good an opportunity to miss. Commodore needed something out ASAP. But rather than develop a whole new system, Commodore got cheap and simply slapped the guts of an Amiga A500 in a box, removed the keyboard, but offering it as an optional extra for £70, and replaced the floppy drive with one of those newfangled CD-ROMs. All this with the cherry on top being an exorbitant £600 price tag for the privilege, double of what an Amiga normally sells for. Obviously, Commodore went to great lengths to disguise the fact it was just a bog-standard Amiga inside, to the point they demanded retailers stock the two products at opposite ends of the store, lest be denied any future stock. Unfortunately, Commodore's dark secret soon got out of the bag, and anyone who wasn't insulted by their blatant bait and switch either bought a regular Amiga or went with Philips' big grey box of poo, as, to be honest, they did have a much more recognisable brand. I mean, look how popular Philips screwdrivers are. So, how many people were gullible enough to fall for a CDTV? Well, in total, it managed to rake in a lowly 30,000 sales. While incredibly pathetic, amazingly, it's only the 5th worst selling console on our list. If you think this stunt was idiotic, madness is defined as doing the exact same thing over and over and expecting different results. Commodore did the exact same tactic 2 years later with the Amiga CD32, which, again, was just an Amiga A1200 slapped inside a box with a CD-ROM on top. And this did so badly, it ended up bankrupting the company. Genius.
Poor old Gizmondo. For all of the good things it had going for it, it had the bad going just as much. For instance, it had an amazing lineup of talented developers making games for it, but it was too darn expensive to play any of them. £230 for a handheld in 2005 was a ridiculous amount of money for one. It used bog-standard SD cards for memory, so no scummy price gouging arbitrary cards like Sony's handhelds, but it also made the device incredibly easy to pirate. Though whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in your books, I'm not one to judge. It had great financial backing to make sure it competed with Sony and Nintendo's handhelds, but the money was coming from the Swedish mafia as an alleged money laundering scheme. Seriously. And if you saw the Rotting Consoles episode of Fact Hunt, you'll also know they're made of a cheap plastic that is literally melting the machine into a pile of sticky goo. But with amazing titles like Mama Can I Mow the Lawn, Richard Burns Rally, Who? And Sticky Balls, what could possibly go wrong? Well, two things really. The whole concept of the Gizmondo was a device to rival the Engage. Yup, the second system on our list solely created to rival a device that no one gave a toss about. Now that's idiotic enough, but the one thing they kinda forgot to put into the machine to rival Nokia's plastic box of rubbish was the ability to actually make phone calls on the thing. Sure, you could send text messages, but who wanted a glorified pager in 2005? Well, less than 25,000 people as a matter of fact, as that's all they ever managed to sell. In all fairness, it was more likely the ridiculous asking price that put the nail in the coffin for the Gizmondo, but even the £100 cheaper ad-enabled version they tried to tempt people with failed to make an impact. You may be the worst handheld selling console of all time, but you'll always have a place in our hearts. Mainly as you've melted in our pocket and we can't remove you without damaging the lining.
Gaming has always had a weird obsession with scanning things for some reason. From Barcode Battler to Amiibos, publishers are adamant that creating digital avatars of collectible real-world tat is the key to success. So it was only a matter of time before some genius decided to turn the whole gimmick into a gaming console, then inevitably managed to completely arse it up. Enter Mattel's second venture into console gaming, the Hyperscan. After a 27-year hiatus since they're pretty good in television, 2006 saw Mattel throwing their hat back into the gaming ring with impressive 16-bit technology at a time when even 128-bit consoles were considered obsolete. But if being stingy on the old bits wasn't bad enough, the entire concept of the Hyperscan revolved around on-disc DLC. Please stop booing this as a retrospect. Where Mattel had the audacity to charge you for expensive booster packs for not just additional characters already in the game, but even basic things like special moves. And the worst thing, they couldn't even do that right. The scanning feature barely worked. You'd be desperately trying to scan in moves while your opponent is handing your ass to you. The console suffered from absolutely abysmal 3-minute long loading times, and finally, only 5 games were ever made for it. And they were all crap. So how did this affect sales? Well, with such terrible features, and the Xbox 360 and PS3 totally eclipsing it in promotion, Mattel's Hyperscan managed to sell a rather sad 10,000 units. And most of them were returned because the scanning component broke quicker than a lie detector operated by Sean Murray. So, after less than 8 months on sale, Mattel quickly dropped the Hyperscan and never ventured into gaming since. In hindsight, if they'd worked the concept into an already existing console, it could have been a completely different story. After all, that's exactly what Activision did with Skylanders a year later and made insane amounts of money. But it appears merging a game console with a supermarket checkout was a catastrophic failure. Who'da thunk?
Of course, there's bound to be at least one system on this list that absolutely no one has ever heard of. And this list's nominee belongs to the Casio PV-1000. While they're more well known in the West for making electronic keyboards and calculators, Casio were rather famous in Japan for creating computers. Now, the console itself may look like the bastard love child of a Mega Drive and a Jaguar CD, but it was a pretty impressive little machine for 1983 and sported a Z80 processor, which has been used in everything from the ColecoVision to the Neo Geo. But sadly, due to its incredibly short life, and I do mean short, it was only on the market for less than 2 months, it only sported a grand total of 15 games. And most of those were Namco and Konami arcade ports. Oh, yes, and Mahjong. Because, by golly, we gotta have endless bloody Mahjong games for a Japanese system. Okay, so why did it fail? Quite simple, really. Casio did a Sega in the 80s and flooded the market with a whopping 4 different systems the exact same year. I'm talking about the PV-1000, a superior but totally incompatible format to the 1000, and 2 MSX computers, the PV-7 and the PV-16, which were wildly popular computers in their own right in Japan. So Casio not only saturated their own market with themselves as their own competition, but released an inferior system that was almost the same price as its other, more powerful systems. Absolute genius. Okay, so how many PV-1000s were sold in total then? Well, it was less than 9,000. Yes, I can hear your Vegeta memes through time and the internet itself, but other than Casio being complete morons and saturating the market, the main reason it sold such a tiny number was because Casio saw how terrible it was performing in the market, so to save face and most likely the wrath from their shareholders, immediately pulled it from shelves after only weeks on sale. I know it sounds completely insane, but it makes the PV-1000 the shortest ever retailing console in history. But even then, with less than 9,000 units sold, amazingly, it is still not the worst selling console of all time. No, that honor goes to...
Just before we get to our number one, I'm going to quickly discuss 3 consoles that arguably should or shouldn't be included here. So consider this me covering my bases. Ultimately, I didn't include them as they all require additional hardware in order to operate. So you be the boss on if these should or shouldn't be included. First up is the Laseractive, Pioneer's short-lived Laserdisc based system. If this had been on the list, it would have been a smidgen above the Casio PV-1000 with just 10,000 sales. This sold miserably due to being sold at a ludicrous $970 back in the day. That's $1,634 in today's money. I decided not to include the system, mainly as it's a console in the very loosest definition. Its library nearly entirely consisted of glorified FLV games, something any disc-based device could also perform. And its insane $600 add-ons were essentially standalone Genesis and TurboGrafx in their own right anyway. So from Laserdisc reliant systems, we come to VHS reliant. The Action Max is as basic as they come. A light gun that reacted to flashing images on screen, so simply covering the barrel of a gun with your hand would stop you from losing points. Unfortunately, even with such thrilling titles as Point 38 Ambush Alley and The Rescue of Pops Ghostly, it only managed to draw even with the Laseractive, with a disappointing 10,000 sales again. However, this may also just be US sales. It was also released in the UK, so that number may not be totally concrete. But one console that did remain North American exclusive was Ideal Toys Viewmaster Interactive. Despite having the exact same name as Mattel's world-famous viewfinder toy, it was rather ingenious and would overlay graphics in time with VHS footage. But despite having a controller that looked like a fishing rod that had been dry-hubbed by Salvador Dali, it was aimed at kids, and with only 7 games released on it, 6 of them being Sesame Street related, it only dragged in a pathetic 5,000 sales. Which, spoiler alert, even if it was on this list, it still would have only been number 2. There's also the Super ACAN and a whole plethora of other obscure Chinese machines, but I'd be here all day with them, and most of them are based off Famiclone technology anyway. So come on, give me some kind of break here. Remember earlier when I said Commodore got cheap with the CDTV and CD32 and just used an already existing computer, removed the keyboard and shoved it out in the market in a desperate attempt to compete with Sega and Nintendo? Well, guess what they did 3 years prior? That's right! The Commodore C64GS is literally just a regular Commodore 64 without a keyboard. I mean, they didn't even add a cartridge port to the thing. The regular Commodore 64 already had one to begin with. And they couldn't even get that feature right. Commodore's initial idea was to piggyback off the success of Terminator 2 and bundle the system with a cartridge copy of the movie license. Sounds like a great plan. Problem is, as soon as you turn the game on, it tells you to press enter to start. So the launch killer app for the console is completely useless, as you literally can't get past the title screen without a keyboard. The one thing the C64GS is missing. And on top of that, Commodore released a C64GS just £50 lower than a standard Commodore 64. So the real nail in the coffin for the system was, for half a ton more, you get far more features and the ability to play games on cassette and disc for as little as £1.99. The same 2-year-old games Commodore was expecting you to pay £35 on cartridge for. Absolute genius! Obviously, as this is the #1 slot, you can tell that sales were pretty abysmal. But you seriously wouldn't believe how bad. Commodore produced 20,000 units, primarily for sale in the UK and Germany, and sold a grand total of 2,000. Yes, 2,000. Even the European TurboGrafx, which apparently doesn't exist, sold more consoles than that. But if you're wondering if the remaining 18,000 consoles are buried in some British landfill, you're sadly wrong. Since they literally were just Commodore 64s inside, Commodore just ripped them out their cases and stuck the keyboard back on to sell them as regular computers. So, the world's greatest selling 8-bit home computer in history also spawned the world's worst selling console in history. Oh, the irony!